Section 3 of the Cambridge History of English Literature, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sonia. The Cambridge History of English Literature, Volume 1. From the Beginnings to the Cycles of Romance. Runes and Manuscripts, Part 2, by A.C. Paues. Not so, however, with the Irish school of writing in the north. The Irish alphabet was founded on the Roman half-uncial hand. Manuscripts of this type having been brought over to Ireland by missionaries, perhaps during the 5th century. Owing to the isolated position of the island and the consequent absence of extraneous influence, a strongly characteristic national hand developed, which ran its uninterrupted course down to the late Middle Ages. This hand was at first round in character, and of great clearness, beauty, and precision, but at an early period a modified, pointed variety of a minuscule type developed out of it, used for quicker and less ornamental writing. In the 7th century Northumbria was Christianized by Irish missionaries, who founded monasteries and religious settlements throughout the north. What, then, more natural than that these zealous preachers of the word should teach their disciples not only the word itself, but also how to write it down in characters pleasing to the Almighty, and not in rude and uncouth signs which conveyed all the power and magic of the heathen gods. Thus it came to pass that the English of the north learned the exquisite penmanship of the Irish, and proved themselves such apt pupils that they soon equalled their former masters. In fact, the earliest specimens of the Northumbrian hand can scarcely be distinguished from their Irish models. In course of time, moreover, the English threw off the conventions and restraints which fettered the Irish hand, and developed a truly national hand, which spread throughout England, and which, in grace of outline and correctness of stroke, even surpassed its prototype. As might have been expected, the English adopted both the round and pointed varieties of their Irish teachers. One of the earliest and most beautiful examples of the former is the Book of Durham, or the Lindisfarne Gospels, written about A.D. 700 by Eardfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne. And as a specimen of the latter may be mentioned a fine copy of Bede's Ecclesiastical History in the University Library of Cambridge, written not long after 730, which possesses an additional interest as preserving one of the earliest pieces of poetry in the English language, the Hymn of Cadman, in the original Northumbrian dialect. The pointed hand branched off into a number of local varieties, and was extensively used down to the 10th century, when it became influenced by the French or Carolingian minuscule. Towards the end of the century all Latin manuscripts were, as a matter of fact, written in foreign characters, whereas the English hand came to be exclusively used for writing in the vernacular. For instance, a Latin charter would have the body of the text in the French minuscule, but the English descriptions or boundaries of the property to be conveyed would be written in the native hand. After the Conquest, the native hand gradually disappeared, the only traces of it left being the adoption by the foreign alphabets of the symbols win, yoh, thorn, eth, to express the peculiarly English sounds for which they stood. The rune win, however, fell into disuse about the beginning of the 14th century, its place having been taken by u, v, or w, while eth, th, occurs occasionally as late as the end of the same century. Of far superior vitality were thorn and yoh, the former bearing a charmed life throughout Middle English times, though in the 15th century and later thorn often appeared in the degenerated form of y, while yoh was retained in order to represent spirant sounds, afterwards denoted by y or gh. During the late 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, the history of English handwriting was practically that of the various Latin hands of the French school. The 15th century finally witnessed the dissolution of the medieval bookhand of the minuscule type, the many varieties of it being apparent in the types used by the early printers. The legal or charter hand, introduced with the Conquest, was, however, not superseded by the printing presses, but ran an undisturbed, though ever varying course down to the 17th century, when its place was taken by the modern current hand, fashioned on Italian models. A late variety still lingers on, however, in the so-called chancery hand, seen in the engraved writing of enrollments and patents. Turning to the materials used for writing in medieval England, we gain at once a connecting link with the runic alphabet, since the wooden tablet, the bock, again appears, though in a somewhat different fashion. A thin coating of wax was now spread over the surface, and the writing was scratched on it with a pointed instrument of metal or bone, which, in Old English, was known as greffe, and in the later centuries by the French term pointel. The use of these tablets was widely spread in the Middle Ages. They served for the schoolboys' exercises and for bills and memoranda of every description, for short letters and rough copies, for anything that was afterwards to be copied out more carefully on vellum. In German illuminated manuscripts, poets are represented as writing their songs and poems on waxen tablets, and as early as the 6th century the rule of St. Bennet makes provision for the distribution of tablets and styles to monks. There is also evidence of the use of these tablets by Irish monks, who, it may be supposed, would introduce them to their English pupils. And consequently we find that Aldhelm, who died in 709, writes a riddle of which the answer is tablet, a fact which presupposes a knowledge of the existence of tablets among his contemporaries. Again, in Ethelwald's Benedictionale of the 10th century, Zacharias (Luke 1:3) is represented as writing on a waxen tablet. In the 12th century we learn concerning Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury (died 1109), that he was in the habit of making the first sketch of his works on waxen tablets, and in the Canterbury Tales Chaucer relates how the summoner's fellow had a pair of tables all of ivory, and a pointel y-polished fetisly. Far more important, practical, and durable as writing material, however, was parchment or vellum, the use of which prevailed throughout the Middle Ages. The Old English name for this was bokvel, literally bookskin, replaced in Middle English by the French terms parchement and vellin, vellum. These terms originally were not interchangeable, vellum being, as its name indicates, prepared from calfskins, parchment from sheepskins. Footnote. From Hamlet 5:1 it appears, however, as if Shakespeare was unaware of this difference. Is not parchment made of sheepskins? Ay, my lord, and of calfskins too. End of footnote. At first the evidence goes to show that monasteries had to prepare their own parchment, either by the help of the monks themselves or of laymen engaged for the purpose. Later, however, the parchment makers took their place as ordinary craftsmen, and supplied religious and other houses with the necessary material. Thus we find that, in the year 1300, Ely bought 5 dozen parchments and as many vellums, and, about half a century later, no less than 70 and 30 dozen respectively, in order to supply the want of writing material for a few years only. Vellum was, at times, magnificently colored, the text being, in such cases, inscribed in letters of gold or silver. The most famous example is the Codex Argenteus at Upsala. Archbishop Wilfrid of York (664 709) is said to have possessed the 4 Gospels written on purple vellum in letters of purest gold, a fact which his biographer records as little short of the marvellous. In the British Museum there remains to this day an Old English manuscript of the Gospels, the first leaves of which are written in golden letters on purple vellum. Apart from these éditions de luxe, which naturally must have been of enormous cost, ordinary working parchment was a very expensive writing material, and it is small wonder if, on that account, it gradually had to give way before a new and less costly material. It appears that, from times immemorial, The manufacture of paper from linen rags and hemp was known to the Chinese, who apparently taught their art to the Arabs, since paper was exported by that nation at an early date. In the 12th century paper was known in Spain and Italy, and thence it spread slowly northwards, though it did not come into more general use until the 14th century. In the 15th century paper manuscripts were very frequent in England, as can be assumed from the great number still remaining in public and private libraries. For writing, both on parchment and on paper, the quill was used, known in Old English times as fether, in Middle English by the French term pen. The existence of the quill as an implement of writing is proved by one of the oldest Irish manuscripts, where St. John the Evangelist is represented holding a quill in his hand. Again, Aldhelm has a riddle on penna in the same way as he had one on the tablet. Other necessary implements for writing and preparing a manuscript were a lead for ruling margins and lines, a ruler, a pair of compasses, scissors, a puncher, an awl, a scraping knife, and, last but not least, ink, which was usually kept in a horn, either held in the hand by the scribe or placed in a specially provided hole in his desk. In Old English times it was known, from its color, as black, but after the Conquest the French term encre, our modern English ink, was adopted. The terms horn and inkhorn are both found in old glossaries. When the body of the text was finally ready, the sheets were passed to the corrector, who filled the office of the modern proofreader, and from him to the rubricator, who inserted, in more or less elaborate designs and in striking colors, the rubrics and initials for which space had been left by the scribe. The pieces of parchment were then passed to the binder, who, as a rule, placed 4 on each other and then folded them, the result being a quire of 8 leaves or 16 pages. The binding was generally strong and solid in character. Leather was used for the back, and wooden boards for the sides, which were usually covered with parchment of leather or velvet. Thus was established the form and fashion of the book as we know it, whether written or printed. Besides the book form, parchment was also made up into rolls, which were especially used for chronological writings and deeds of various kinds. Footnote: cf. the term Master of the Rolls. End of footnote. The men who wrote both roll and book, and to whose patience and devotion we owe so much of our knowledge of the times gone by, were, at first, the monks themselves, it being held that copying, especially of devotional books, was a work pleasing to God, and one of the best possible ways in which men, separated from the world, could labor. Gradually, however, there grew up a professional class of scribes, whose services could be hired for money, and who can be proved to have been employed at an early period in the monasteries of England and abroad. Nuns were also well versed in writing. Moreover, where schools were attached to monasteries, the alumni were early pressed into service, at all events to copy out books needed for their own instruction. The cloister was the center of life in the monastery, and in the cloister was the workshop of the patient scribe. It is hard to realize that the fair and seemly handwriting of these manuscripts was executed by fingers which, on winter days, when the wind howled through the cloisters, must have been numbed by the icy cold. It is true that, occasionally, little carols or studies in the recesses of the windows were screened off from the main walk of the cloister, and sometimes a small room or cell would be partitioned off for the use of a single scribe. This room would then be called the scriptorium, but it is unlikely that any save the oldest or most learned of the community were afforded this luxury. In these scriptoria of various kinds, the earliest annals and chronicles in the English language were penned, in the beautiful and painstaking forms in which we know them. There is no evidence for the existence of buildings specially set apart for libraries until the later Middle Ages. Books were stored in presses, placed either in the church or in convenient places within the monastic buildings. These presses were then added to as need arose, or perhaps a small room was set apart for the better preserving of the precious volumes. Books were frequently lost through the widespread system of lending both to private persons and to communities, and, though bonds were solemnly entered into for their safe return, neither anathema nor heavy pledges seemed sufficient to ensure the return of the volumes. But all losses through lending, or fire, or pillage, were as nothing compared with the utter ruin and destruction that overtook the literature of England, as represented by the written remains of its past, when the monasteries were dissolved. By what remains we can estimate what we have lost, and lost irrevocably, but the full significance of this event for English literary culture will be discussed in a later chapter. End of section 3.